of an initiative called Alternatives to Neoliberalism in Southern Africa, which was initiated by the Zimbabweans, drawing in from people across the region. And that was a process that happened over the last 4 years. It ranged from people like Yash Tandon to the late Guy Mhone, Godfrey Kanyense, Tendai Makanza, and others in the region who've been part of organized labor or organized grassroots formations that tried to move the question of where to move from where we now. Is it Africa's turn? And we felt it's long been overdue. It didn't need this formal economic crisis that we talk about. So now, when unemployment reaches 8, 9, or 10% in USA and Europe, they're talking of massive crisis. When in our countries we have 40% for 20 years in Namibia since independence. In South Africa, they're getting as desperate as declaring car guards as employed people to bring unemployment to around 30% officially. In Zimbabwe and Zambia and Malawi, we have 90% of workers in the informal economy, likewise in Ghana. And then you can really ask, global crisis, what crisis? When you look at it from an African perspective, this crisis has hit us for 40 years. Or at least 30, since the advent of structural adjustment programs in the late 70s. And they've destroyed Africa's economy to an extent that was truly an economic tsunami. And in the light of that, we didn't need to wait for that meltdown. Now, coming from the labor movement and the labor-based research organization, one dilemma that labor always faced is what was raised by some speakers this morning, the question of where do we position ourselves as a labor movement, reform or revolution? And you pointed it very clearly with Rosa Luxemburg's one. That issue has remained with labor until that day. And I just want to quote one sentence from a statement by the biggest global trade union federation, the International Trade Union Confederation, which warned in 2007 about the pending economic collapse due to financialization. And they said, risks and rewards are extremely unevenly divided in the private equity model. Workers bear the brunt of risks, costs, and sacrifices, while managers of private equity funds pocket the gains. So far, no disagreement. And then comes the interesting sentence. This constitutes a basic injustice, the cruelest kind of capitalism, and needs to be subjected to rules and regulations so that the risks and the benefits are shared. We're going to share the risks and benefits with global capital. That is the official position, and that's the official tragedy. And that position is largely driven by the unions of the core countries, EU, North America. That's their position. The calls for more radical alternatives have consistently been shut down, and that has very much to do that the uneven effects of neoliberal globalization have hit African workers far harder than they've hit European workers. And we mustn't close the eyes to this geopolitical global reality, that there is a difference in which these processes have hit African workers, Latin American workers, European and American workers. It's not in the same way. And that has caused the kind of alternatives and the debates on it to be also quite uneven. There are, of course, pockets of more radical thought in the core countries as well, no doubt. But on a mass base, the American and European unions have played the role of putting the brakes on more radical alternatives. And we've seen that in meetings, we've seen that through donor funding as well, where donors come and say, if unions want programs on poverty reduction strategy papers, this would be structural adjustment with a human face, there are funds for it. And half of Africa's trade unions run into workshops supported by German political foundations on structural adjustment programs. That is global reality, and that influences your thinking and your response. And I agree with Professor Arisitas that we don't see the end of capitalism, and not even the end of neoliberalism, maybe in its crudest forms, but it will re-emerge. Because as long as there is no concrete alternative that can start with the here and now, that space will be filled very quickly. And that is where Venezuela comes into the picture. Not that we didn't have attempts before. Nyerere's Tanzania, Samora Machel's Mozambique, the early Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Patrice Lumumba in the DRC. where we had the seeds of alternative policies that were usually killed through brutal military coups. So it's not that Africa didn't have the seeds. But what is so interesting about Venezuela is, after a similar history of class exploitation, of racialized politics, and of subjugation of a whole continent to capital and imperialist interests, there is a re-emerging of something, a movement from below happening. The mass media often attribute it to Chavez as this charismatic leader, which he is.